1330 WBTM. Jack Garrett, how are you this morning?
Doing well. Good to see you.
Been looking forward to this morning, talking about Raven Records, a little record company here in Danville, run by a guy who worked in the electronics department at Kmart.
If you grew up in Danville in the 60s, you remember the Soul Masters.
Mm-hmm.
Raven Records, which was on Old Piney Forest Road. Frank Koger ran the studio. He later moved to Nashville. He had connections there. But along the way, especially in 66, 67, he recorded some great records, and that's really why we're here.
Where do you have the studio?
Actually, the studio no longer stands. It's basically in the vicinity of where the Merchants Delivery Building is now, just a small house. They called it the House of Sound, by the way. Barely big enough for a five-piece band, much less the Soul Masters, all 12 of them ganged in there. Two-track recorder, and some amazing music came out of those walls.
And by mentioning two-track recorder, now they have 16, 32, 64 tracks. They put each individual one on each individual track. And so when you go back and listen to these records, what they did with them with a limited amount of equipment was absolutely amazing.
But as they say, today's music ain't got the same soul.
That's exactly right. And we want to kind of set up the difference between the way music worked then as opposed to now. Now you have basically, if you've got to sign in with a big record company, and the latest estimates are it takes about $1.5 million in terms of promotion to get a record played. Not so back then. It was more of a cottage industry, wasn't it?
That's right. You had independent labels everywhere. The Occasions, I mean, their label was picked up, they were on a small label, I think it came out of Dunn, North Carolina, and ABC picked up Girl Watcher, and it went national. Well, the Soul Masters did I'll Be Waiting Here. They pressed 500 copies. That record actually made the charts on WLAC in Nashville. Heavy play on all three stations in Danville.
And for somebody who's not from here, let's listen to a little bit of it.
Give it a listen.
Yes, Soul Masters.
Larry Davis.
And they kind of started in North Carolina and moved to Danville, but an interesting story, and once again showing the difference in the times then and now. They had two black lead vocalists.
John Irby and Jerry Wilson, yes. They had some problems. They were kicked out of a restaurant in Carolina Beach that would not serve blacks at the time. But they persevered. I spoke to their keyboard player, who told me that, they just basically said, "Welcome to my world. This happens all the time." Bill Adams told me that. But, the incredible thing is if you heard this band live, they had 3 sax players, 2 trumpets, a full rhythm section, the 2 vocalists. They would just literally blow you away. Packed the Coke plant, the 360 drive-in with the Tams. This was, a phenomenon locally.
And they had this kind of band with these kinds of horn sections and things probably 10 years before you had Blood, Sweat, and Tears in Chicago and the bands that made that kind of sound famous on a big level. That was a lot of people in a band back then, and you didn't make a lot of money playing back then.
No, they didn't make anything. But there were so many missed opportunities for the Soul Masters. They were supposed to do Amateur Night at the famed Apollo in New York, but Martin Luther King was assassinated, so that was scrubbed. They were supposed to do a month-long tour with Arthur Conley, who wanted them to be his backing band.
Sweet soul music.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But in high school, their parents said, "No way."
This was supposed to be in Europe, you said?
Yes, they were supposed to do a month-long European tour. That would have been 67 as well.
And it's interesting as you mentioned this because we're talking to Jack Garrett this morning, talking about Raven Records, a little record company here in Danville, run by a guy who worked in the electronics department at Kmart. And if you look at the history of these bands and some of the things that happened to them, this is almost like one of these VH1 Behind the Music, the things that derailed them and their opportunities had everything to do with the fact that these were teenage guys. You had some of them have to change singers because they're getting drafted all the time.
Yeah, Gene and the Teen Beats. They were based in Martinsville. A number of Danville's finest musicians. Gene Rumley fronted the group on sax. Ricky Fox started in the band as a drummer. He played bass and guitar.
He's still a great musician, by the way.
Lonnie Woodall was in the group. You just had a host of musicians from the area. And they did 3 records, the last 2 of which were on Raven. Started in 1959, recorded for nearly 10 years up through 1968. Their third record, which I prefer, I'll Let Nothing Separate Me, was excellent. It's a cover of a Wallace Brothers single that actually went nowhere. But Gene and his drummer would actually get in the station wagon and drive all the way up to Delaware, talk to DJs just to get their record on the radio. And it worked. For their second, I Want to Be Your Baby, that received extensive airplay all over the East Coast, basically just, self-promoting, as Gene says.
And another thing that was different then as opposed to now, most radio stations were owned by individual owners like ours is, or like ours is owned locally. Now most radio stations are owned by huge groups. You've got to go to the head of the group in Chicago or somewhere to get something played. It's much more corporate. So back then, you had a better chance of being from Danville and getting a record played somewhere.
Sure, you could go eyeball to eyeball with the announcer. Let's listen to the Team Beats.
All right. And when you're riding down the road, listening to that kind of stuff, it's hard to believe, once again, they were recorded in little bitty studios, not in these huge digital places.
2-track recorder, if you can believe that.
Yes.
And, one of my favorites is a garage band from South Boston, the Individuals. Ronnie Couch's band. He had shoulder-length hair in '65. You can see it in the photographs here.
That was before any high school guys had shoulder-length hair.
Can you imagine in this tiny town of Halifax? And Tommy Red, who was the lead vocalist and bass player, they were just incredibly talented. Again, they went, they started out, they would play dance halls like the Oak Level Club. They would have a country and western night, if you can believe that. And then the following night, they'd have the Individuals playing rock and roll for 4 hours. They played the City Armory. They played the Halifax County Fair. And they also did Homer T's T-Bird Country out on 58, a double bill one Christmas Eve with the Soul Masters.
And we got about a minute to go. Another one of these little stories about how groups like this, because they're teenagers, a lot of times managed by daddy, can sometimes get derailed. When they had their record pressed, the guy who pressed the record and charged them the money and then sent it to Nashville to be produced sent the wrong
master tape. So the B-side you hear today is an outtake.
Yes.
But this is the A-side, I Want Love, and it's a screaming raver. Listen to Tommy Red's bass line and vocal.
I love you, baby, yes I do.
And you can imagine listening to that on late night radio alongside anything else that was out there at the time, just as good.
They made $75 a night, split 5 ways. Can you imagine? That wouldn't even pay for guitar strings and drumsticks.
We're talking to Jack Garrett about his great article in Showcase Magazine, and you also personally experienced being in one of these groups. You had one with Tom Etheridge and a couple
of
the
Royal Tramps. When we were supposed to record for Cochran, we'd actually talked him down to $35. He was going to press 50 records for us if we provided the master tape.
So Tom negotiated that down, huh?
He did. His dad was supposed to record it at the audiovisual department at Danville Regional. He was head of the department at the time. Unfortunately, the guitarist and bass player brothers decided that they wanted to go on a church trip to Lakeside Amusement Park. So Herb washed his hands of the Tramps.
I can imagine. Because there you had two boys who were absolutely fanatical about getting recorded. The other had something come up at the last minute, and they just didn't have time.
But can you imagine 500 records for $200?
Man. And can you imagine what it would be like for you to have a couple of copies of that still today? And you said, as you were calling some of these guys to catch up on this for the article, one of them actually deleted the message.
Didn't believe that anyone had any interest in these bands after 40 years. But Ronnie Couch was amazing because he kept everything. Photographs, memorabilia, clippings, charts from the radio stations in South Boston, old reel tapes of the band. And he still lives it and loves it.
Man, and you're still steeped in it yourself, which is a good thing because somebody needs to be the caretaker of all this history.
Someone needs to remember these bands. They're far too good to be forgotten.
And if you don't want to forget them, get a copy of Showcase Magazine. Jack, once again, great job appreciate all the history on this because a lot of people are going to go, oh, I remember that, yes. But what this does more than that is gives people a behind-the-scenes look of what these people almost were able to accomplish, were it not for the fact that they were teenage boys with typical distractions.
Just kids.